Croeso I Gŵyl Haf. Welcome to Gŵyl Haf, and today with me I have the wonderful Tanya Huntington. She is a visual artist and translator living in Mexico City. She has a PhD in Latin American literature and is also here to sort of focus in on what this video is particularly for our younger viewers. You're very welcome to watch it whatever age you are, especially if you're learning Spanish. It might be really useful for you, but it is targeted at sort of people who might be considering whether Spanish is something they want to pursue further, and whether translating itself is something that they would like to take further as well. So thank you so much, Tanya, for joining me.
I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Not at all. If you come with Zoom backdrops like that, we'll have you back every year.
Well, I figure, as we say in the States, if life gives you lemons, you might as well make a little lemonade. And so I decided to do a backdrop that was a little different, maybe from some of the other ones, and try to pay a small tribute to our friends, the bees, who need our recognition and support these days.
Quite, start strong, start with environment, the way every talk should be started.
No, 100%.
What was your sort of, to open it up a little bit, how did you get into translation? Did you grow up bilingual or did you learn Spanish in later life?
I think that a lot of us who are from countries like the States, we have these rather complex origin stories. Like somebody from the States is rarely from a single place. We tend to sort of be spread out in our early biographies, and my case is no different. My father was teaching at a Lakota reservation called Eagle Butte when I was born, and so all of my family is from South Dakota, which is already not very common. And then, I was born into the situation where one of the subjects that he was teaching in high school to the Oglala Sioux who lived there was Spanish. And so really my father was my first teacher. And I remember, leafing through the textbook and whatnot, and he would teach me these little tricks. One of his dreams was to take his students, something that unfortunately they tried fundraising, they were never able to scrape enough money together, but one of his dreams was to take his students to Mexico City to see the marvelous murals of the National Autonomous University, the world famous public university, and to show them these two marvelous volcanoes that were just outside the city. And he taught me a little trick to remember their names because their names are in Nahuatl and in Spanish. He said, just remember that one of them is purple caterpillar, Popocatépetl, right? And the other one is extra seawater, Ixtaccíhuatl. And although he wasn't unable to make it there himself at that time, he really never imagined, I think, that this little daughter of his was going to grow up and live in that city under those two volcanoes and become a naturalized Mexican citizen, And so once you start down the path of teaching your children a language or having them learn a language, you never know where that's going to end, And so I always chose Spanish as my elective growing up. And then when I was studying at university, I was studying both theater and Latin American literature, or Hispanic literature, I suppose, at that point. I lived for a year in Spain. And so that's what got me started. When I came back and I was doing office work, temping over the summers to try and make ends meet, there's always a bit of extra time when you're in an office, This was before internet came along to sort of fill up all of the free time that one had between one thing and the next. And so I decided to fill that time by translating a play by Federico Garcia Lorca called Así que pasan 5 años, just for the fun of it. I think sort of in the spirit of those characters that you read about in 19th century novels that would learn a language by translating, I think that was perhaps my motivation. And so that was, I suppose, my first translation, of course, never published, never seen by anyone, but it was my first sort of foray into this wonderful profession, which has accompanied me since then.
And oh, that's so sorry. I was so lost in that story. I forgot to prepare myself for the next question. I do. I've always had a bit of a fascination with Mexico City. I think this is sort of on the down low of Gŵyl is that I actually am basically monolingual. I have a smattering of Welsh, and Spanish is the language I would like to learn, and very much sort of just in the way that we do always idealize things that we are unfamiliar with or like wish after, or in the same way that you idealize something that you're separated from. I think Mexico City has always been a bit of one of those beacons for me. What when you sort of did progress from, like, what was the steps between translating your first Lorca play, for fun, and sort of ending up in Mexico City with translating being a part of your actual job? Was there a sort of, because I know that you also do quite a lot of visual arts, so was that what that led you there, or was there a sort of meandering path?
Well, I would hate to dissuade anyone from a life in the arts, because it has been my life and I would never trade it for anything in the world. But, speaking as someone who grew up doing theater, and then, I studied literature as sort of a more practical option, if you can imagine, and I'm a poet and I'm a visual artist. All of these are doomed to semi-starvation in practical economic terms, shall we say. And so I would say live in the arts if possible, but of course have a day job, have something that is going to keep the lights on, because you're going to need it, while you're sort of making all of these creative dreams come true to a certain extent. And so in my case, when I came here to Mexico, it was pretty evident that it was going to be teaching English, or teaching different subjects as I progressed sort of academically through graduate school and whatnot. Or another option that really became very clear very early on was translation, because it's sort of beneficial to be someone who's a native speaker of a language who lives in another society. And as you know, for all sorts of reasons, English is the international language right now. And especially here in Mexico, as a border country with the United States, there's been this very long-standing relationship where, for whatever reasons, business or otherwise, it necessitates a lot of translation. And so really my first sort of constant translation gigs had to do with business, with public relations, that sort of thing. And so I did a lot of translations of press, press bulletins, or just sort of summaries in English of media that was coming out in Spanish, just to once again sort of keep things moving. And I think something wonderful is that as you advance, as the years go by, you can start to pick and choose your projects a little more, And so what I've been doing lately can vary from, for example, this book of poetry by Malva Flores called Mudanza del Árbol. I sort of translated it freely as Passage of the Tree. All my fellow translators out there will know that titles are always the biggest challenge, the most difficult thing. This is associated with a bilingual review that I co-edit, and that we put out a lot of translation of short stories, of poetry, because we have sort of I would almost call it a political intent there, to sort of break down the lack of understanding in the United States of what Mexican culture is, and what contemporary Mexican literature is. But then in terms of kind of constant work, I found that, a lot of the museums and institutions in Mexico, when they have a big exhibit, for example, this marvelous one dedicated to the color red in the history of painting, which for many centuries was created using this little bug that lives on cactus leaves in Oaxaca and other parts of Mexico, and which was the red used, for centuries, even in European painting. And so all of these sorts of coffee table books, they want them to be bilingual. And so I did the English version for this. And so, from poetry to the arts, novels that I've been translating lately are, for example, this one that by David Miklos for this wonderful publishing house, Argonautica, where I think you interviewed Robin Myers recently. She has work in this collection as well. This is fairly original. They're publishing the novels side by side in the original and then in the translation, in case maybe your Spanish is halfway there and you just want to be able to sort of compare and contrast. And so fortunately, I would say I don't have to do those press releases anymore. I can sort of focus on more interesting projects. But I will say it's always been something I can depend on, even in economic crisis or in quarantine, such as the one that we're currently being subjected to. There will always be people who want their work in English, available in English. And so I don't really feel, that there's a threat in that sense to the field. I mean, there are those who will come along and say every now and then, but what about artificial intelligence? What about machine translation? Which I'm sure is a topic that you've covered extensively in the festival. But personally, I've seen those translations and I don't feel threatened, not at this point.
I think, funny enough, I did my undergraduate dissertation on basically artificial intelligence and a bunch of things like that. But one of the things that was really clear is creativity is the last thing that gets translated, and actually translation is creative and gets what do you call it? What's the word? I've lost the word now. Autonomized. One of the last things that computers can do. Creativity is sort of the safest of your jobs, and actually your lawyers, your doctors are much more under threat than actually, even though language translation has come all this way, like this next step is actually creativity. And so that would be my point of view. Everything that you mentioned, the review, which is called Literal, and Literal, a Latin American Voices, and that publisher that was it like a bit like the Argonauts? Is that what the Argonautica? Or anyway, they'll all be linked below if people want to see them. And like have access to those bilingual books and stuff. That'll all be down below. Is there so moving on to sort of like thinking about Spanish as a language? Is there, well, lots of points. One that you sort of articulated there is that actually Spanish is very widely spoken, so potentially quite a beneficial one from the business point of view, from the press release, the security of translation in that community. Is there anything about Spanish beyond its sort of breadth and its variety that is both challenging and then is maybe interesting, or is sort of the joy of Spanish as a language?
Well, I think I really did fall in love with the language, and that has to do with culture. Obviously, you can't separate one from the other, but I do have I think some anecdotes along the way. I started out with this year in Spain. And so, of course, Feceaba, many of my teachers had been from Spain. And so then after that, when I made the move to Mexico, I mean, as you said, Spanish is not the most spoken language in the world per capita, but it is the language that covers the greatest geographic distance, in terms of areas occupied by Spanish speakers. But of course, they're not the same, and so when I first arrived to Mexico, I think the first thing that my future brother-in-law, upon meeting me, said to me, he said, "¿Qué hubo le?" And I just remember having this really sinking sensation, thinking, "Oh no, I'm going to have to start all over again." This is going to be a whole new ball game, because the Spanish spoken in Mexico is very different, of course, from the Spanish that is spoken in Spain. And I think, the graduate studies that I did in the University of Maryland, where I worked with just amazing, amazing figures as diverse as Jose Emilio Pacheco, the great poet, was a mentor of mine there. Something that he said was that the great thing about that kind of graduate program is that you get Spanish speakers from all over the world, And so you start to become a little more familiar with what the jargon would be in, say, Buenos Aires, or what it would be in different parts of Spain, which of course have very strong differences, and you start to kind of become accustomed to the different accents, the different vocabularies, which helps you as a translator, because if you first come to Mexico and you read for the first time a novel, say like Pedro Páramo, which is a classic, these authors were trying to write in Mexican Spanish. They were no longer trying to write this sort of universal, and so it becomes very colloquial. And from a translator standpoint, oof, that opens up all sorts of wonderful conundrums and challenges. What sort of colloquial English are you going to translate it into, for example, from what region? A complaint that I see often here in Mexico in terms of translation is a lot of the great literature from the United States passes through Europe before it gets back here, and so a lot of the novels that were really big in the States in the 80s and 90s, say Paul Auster, for example, went through Anagrama in Spain and then came here, and readers would laugh a lot about just the sort of differences between, Spanish from Spain and Spanish from Mexico, when you get into dialogue in particular, but I think that all of those are wonderful challenges, and I would say they make me happy. They never are cause for despair. But definitely there is a lot to choose from in terms of different schools of literature, different dialects. It's just endless, and so for me, I think that's it's really wonderful to have a vocation that will never run out. That you will never reach the end of a rope or anything of the sort. Because there's always going to be another 20 books out there that you're just dying to be able to make available to English readership.
Where does the translator and then the Tanya who speaks Spanish and lives her whole life in Spanish, well, I'm sorry, I presume most of your life in Spanish, going about Mexico City, and then maybe quite a significant portion of Zoom time in either language. But how does, for sort of a learner, how might translating and the art of translation fit in with thinking about how they speak the language and how fluent they are in the language, how comfortable they are in it? How do those things overlap or separate?
I think it's marvelous to think about that, because and to think about where your personal limits are, because I am bilingual at this point. I've written books in Spanish, but where's my limit? I don't write poetry in Spanish, for example. And in a sense, I think it's because from the very first, when my father first started to teach me a few words out of this textbook that he was using when I was a child, and I was just fascinated by those upside down question marks and upside down exclamation points and accents and whatnot. The typography I thought was just marvelous. A different Tanya was born, a Hispanic or a Spanish speaking Tanya that went through a very long evolution, very different phases. And she's very different from the English-speaking Tanya who's having this conversation with you right now. It's not the same person, and just in terms of how much of a listener versus how much of an extrovert are you, or even questions that have to do with personality, I would say, are very distinct. And I think that translation is the moment where I can get those two Tanyas sitting down at the same desk and really interchanging communication with one another, really working together in a sense, instead of being at cross purposes or sort of ignoring the other's presence. But yes, definitely, my day-to-day for many years here is mostly in Spanish. I don't live in an expat community like San Miguel de Allende, where my Mexican friends joke, you need a passport to get in there because it's basically an English-speaking retirement community of sorts, and in fact, I would say that my English-speaking friends here are not very numerous, because I really did want to live a life immersed in Mexican culture. In fact, my husband, who's a fantastic author and a very acclaimed author in his own right, he's sort of the Latin American Roald Dahl in a sense, without the problematic biography, perhaps,
Yeah.
the sense that he writes very popular children's literature and very creepy stories for grown-ups, and he does not speak English. And so, it's not sort of, there is no English speaking bubble here, except perhaps for the one that I sustain with my sons when I speak to them. But I do feel like translation is sort of that place where I can get the two Tanyas together and get them working on something that only the two of them can do, which is this process of transforming a book from one language to another, which is really a wonderful experience. I think it's one of my favorite sensations, creatively speaking, is that sort of transformation. I kind of think sometimes of children's stories, those challenges that they always give to the heroine, like, this is a room full of hay and now you have one night to spin it into gold, except when it's translation, it was already gold in the first place, and so you're spinning it into another kind of gold, I suppose.
I like that analogy. You've got to spin it into another kind of gold whilst maintaining it is gold, and not sort of like it falling apart into, maybe I don't know enough about what makes up gold, but into its various elements. How do you sort of, you are, as many translators are, somebody who has a multiple parts to her life, and I was wondering, or to their life, I was wondering how sort of artist Tanya and translator Tanya mix then with those other variations that you're just talking about. Does art feel like a natural extension of translation, or vice versa, or are they quite separate processes for you?
I think that you and the audience of this video are I'm perhaps going to lose you here because you're from a different generation. You're younger than I am. I think that those of us who were born in the Cold War, there was this great pressure to hyper specialize, as sort of the factory, to quote Warhol, although he was very multidisciplinary, of course. And I personally don't believe that the arts are so orthodox. I think they've always been heterodox. And personally, I know that I'm only happy if I have 5 plates in the air at once, I mean, I don't long for a moment where I could just sort of not have to teach classes or not have to edit or not have to translate, so I could only paint. Because one thing feeds into the other constantly. You sort of form a constellation of creativity. And I always fall back on an interview that I translated years ago, co-translated because it was into Spanish, by the Nobel winner, Derek Walcott, who is also a painter. And he said that the great benefit of winning a large award, like the Nobel Prize, is that he could wake up in the morning and really feel free to just sort of consider, what do I feel like today? Writing a poem or painting a picture, just sort of seeing where the mood would lead him or how it would strike him. But I do feel like I'm not alone. I once compiled a list of just 20th century poets who were also painters. It's a very long list. I think that perhaps neuro-linguistically or neurologically, we would find that those compartments are associated, or that they're interrelated somehow, because it's sort of like the mathematicians and musicians, how that goes together so often. I think that there is a sort of a shared area that is a very fertile, very rich terrain to be exploited in different fashions. And also, I mean, just in conclusion, when I teach poetry and design, which is sort of this idea that you can take poetry and every design that you make of it is a sort of artistic exploration, I like to start with Paleolithic art, prehistoric art, and think that, this art was not just a handprint on a wall or an animal on a wall. It formed part of an entire ritual, and poetry was part of that ritual. And in fact, poetry was born as theater, as we all know. And so I think it's a little artificial, this sort of separation that we have into different genres that sort of want to tear the poetry away from the visual art or from the dramatic presentation, etc.
Oh, completely. I couldn't agree with everything you just said more. And it's something I've seen too in people's bios on Wiki. They're always, if they're creative in writing, they have several other projects they do that maybe they're not anything special in, but like the practice is the point, not sort of whether you're good or not. So I wondered if we could, I know that we're going to share now Tanya's translation of a poem and sort of talk our way through it, or Tanya is very much, I'm just going to enjoy myself. This is sort of what a translation looks like in a bit more of a detailed, what's the word, explanation.
I think, well, first of all, I'd like to show you the poem. I can share this on my screen. The poem that I decided just on a lark to translate for this session, is called Ajedrez, and it's by Rosario Castellanos, who is an absolutely fantastic author of 20th century Mexico. She wrote all sorts of prose. Her most famous or most well-known novel is probably Baluncanan. And she's also a very prolific author of poetry. I have a particular sort of affection for her because she was a groundbreaking feminist. She's the first woman from Chiapas, from the state of Chiapas, to be published, which is, 20th centuries, it might seem recent, but things have really come a long way in a very short time for as far as women literature are concerned in Mexico. And she also wrote this marvelous collection of biographies and selections of women authors from around the world that were prefaced by a small essay called Mujer que sabe latín, which is it's a short feminist essay from the early 70s that was published just before her bizarre, untimely death. She was accidentally electrocuted while she was an ambassador to Israel, living in Tel Aviv. Unfortunately, her life was cut far too short. But this essay, Mujer que sabe latín, comes from a refrain in Spanish, which says, Mujer que sabe latín no encuentra marido ni tiene buen fin. A woman who speaks Latin will neither find a husband and will come to no good, and so she had a famously difficult relationship, as many women authors of the mid 20th century had, with her spouse, whom she later divorced, who is a philosopher called Ricardo Guerra. And if you'd like to see a little more about her biography, there's really a marvelous Mexican film that came out fairly recently called Los Adioses. I can give Caitlin the specific reference, the year, for all of you to look up if you're interested. I would really recommend it if you'd like to see a little more about her. And so she chooses for her topic this poem called Chess. And I think it's worthwhile to know something about the biography of an author before you translate, because all of this context that I've just given you is going to help you really understand what this poem means, you know, what the background is, what it is she was trying to say here. And if we think about chess, I don't know how many of you play chess. Caitlin, do you play chess?
Very badly. My brother got very good very quickly. So then it became very not much fun for anyone else to play.
Well, I thought it would be interesting because I know that a lot of people have watched the Queen's Gambit series this year. We had so little original television programming, and so I thought it was, I know that led to a lot of people buying chessboards, you know, and I play with my son, Dylan, and so chess is, of course, one of the few games where there's very, very little left to chance, you know. There is that moment at the beginning where you choose which pawn, and if you happen to choose white, well, then you have a slight advantage because you go first, you know. But really, it is championed, in fact, as a game of intellect, you know. And so here, Rosario Castellanos is basically using the game of chess as a metaphor for the relationship between the sexes in her time. As we know, one of the jobs that we poets have is to define how love is in our time. And we know that it can be drastically different for our grandparents than it is for us. In her case, well, really, it was called the Battle of the Sexes at the time. And as we know, chess is a game basically based on battle, on war, you know. And so she starts it out by saying, porque éramos amigos y a ratos nos amábamos. Quizá para añadir otro interés a los muchos que ya nos obligaban, decidimos jugar juegos de inteligencia. I went line by line here, and I said, because we were friends, and now and again, to sort of preserve that y a ratos that she leaves us with, we loved one another. In order to add an interest, perhaps, to the many that were forced upon us, we decided to play games of intelligence. And so she's really noting here that her generation is the first time where women were even considered to possibly have dealings with their spouse, with their partner, as an intellectual equal, you know, on the same playing field, as it were. Then she continues, pusimos un tablero enfrente de nosotros, equitativo en piezas, en valores, en posibilidad de movimientos, aprendimos las reglas, les juramos respeto, y empezó la partida. So she's describing what the setup is here. And a lot of the language that she's using is actually elusive to the concept of equality between men and women or in relationships. We sat opposite a board, equitable in pieces, values, ranges of movement. We learned the rules, vowed to respect them, and let the match begin. Here I chose to keep the word equitable for equitativo because it really sort of makes me think about equal rights. I chose ranges of movement because she's referring to how different pieces in chess have different possibilities of movement, which is also something that she talks about in that essay on feminism. I chose to use the word vow to respect them because it seemed to me like a nice little sort of gesture, a little wink towards marriage vows, you know, because I feel like that's part of the subtext here. Remember that in the marriage vows, we do say, till death do you part. And while I was working on this translation, I thought, well, that's chess, isn't it? It's a game that lasts until someone dies. And so here's her conclusion. Henos aquí hace un siglo, sentados, meditando encarnizadamente cómo dar el zarpazo último que aniquile de modo inapelable y para siempre al otro. So things get brutal very quickly. We started out with this game of the intellect, with this game of reason, and now it's sort of become survival of the fittest. She says, here we've sat for the past century, ferociously meditating on how to deal the final blow that annihilates the other once and for all. And so the sort of critique that I feel that she's giving to the idea of chess as being a metaphor for a relationship or a modern relationship is that in the end, it's all about one destroying the other, you know, and as long as we think about a relationship as being a battle between the sexes, then this is inevitably going to be the end. We're going to be at cross purposes. We're going to be seeking to take the other out of commission, as it were, you know, and it's all in good fun. And so it's interesting, I think, the different layers that she plays with here and the sort of open-ended suggestion that she leaves to the conclusion that she comes to in this essay, which is that our only way out of this is going to be humor, is going to be, you know, not taking things so seriously and to try and you know, have a good laugh about it all in the end. Although that's not apparent in the poem. Of course, the poem is very dire and very serious in its ending. And so in terms of my version, you know, it's sort of a half-baked version. I might change it. It could still evolve. But I did make a few changes with what we call false friends, you know, words that might make you think that this should go directly into this, you know, that obligaban should be obliged or obligated somehow. And of course, especially when you're translating poetry, although here we don't have to make special considerations for metrics, you know, or a rhyme scheme because it's free verse. We do have to think about how it sounds, you know, and there are little things that you will pick up as a translator along the way, such as, for example, the fact that in Spanish, as we see here in the second stanza, you have equitativo en piezas, coma, en valores, coma, en posibilidad de movimientos. In English, are you going to add the and before that third part? Because it's not so common in English, right? To just have three things and sort of end your sentence. Or perhaps you might have to change around the structure of the sentences because Spanish has several very nice advantages over English, especially when we're talking about poetic creation, that unfortunately we just can't use in English. And I would say one of the principal ones is syntactic arrangement. You know, hyperbaton is very natural, even in modern free verse Spanish poetry. And by that I mean, you know, where is your subject, where is your verb, where is your object? But in English, if you try to fool around with that, I mean, you can get away with it, but it sounds very dated, you know, very old-fashioned, especially in a poem where she's trying to break away from this idea that women only write sentimental poetry, right? And she's writing something that's very rational, very serious. And so I think that that was definitely a challenge. And then of course, at the end, you asked me earlier on, you know, what is something that I really like about Spanish? She uses a subjunctive. This is something that is really wonderful about Spanish. And it's indicative not only of a verbal tense, but of a way of thinking, a way of being in the world that we did away with in English almost entirely. I mean, you might still hear somebody say, if I were king, that were would be sort of subjunctive in English. But unfortunately, for reasons that have to do, I suppose, with our forthrightness and decisiveness and I don't know if we want to ascribe other sorts of characteristics to a verbal tense, but we did away, unfortunately, with this wonderful verbal tense that allows us to imagine what might have happened, but we know it didn't. You know, it's such a delicate thing. Que aniquile de modo inalterable y para siempre al otro. In her version, it's that would annihilate, you know, forever the other person. But can we really put in that woulda, coulda, shoulda in English? You know, I think often, unfortunately, we need to remove it because it just doesn't make the same kind of sense, you know. And so I don't know. That's sort of just to briefly to walk you through some of the choices that you can make while you're making a version of a poem. And something that I think would be a lot of fun would be if some of you tried it out and just sort of came to your own conclusions, your own solutions with some of the verses of this same poem, because something that's actually really incredible about translation, of course, is that it's like what Jorge Luis Borges suggested in The Garden of Forking Paths, you know, or in this quantum reality that has become the vogue in a lot of our superhero movies lately, you know, the idea of parallel realities. Every translation is a parallel version of the source material, you know, and they can be quite different, and yet they are somehow the same, you know. And so anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that. I like translating poetry because I don't think it's read enough, you know, and so it's something that I like to just kind of keep putting out there, mostly through the review, a lot of contemporary poetry, just to keep it reading. And I do feel, I don't know if you'd agree, Caitlin, that in terms of things that the digital revolution has brought us and has taken away, something that perhaps it has brought us is a lot more poetry, you know, because somehow it's a format, especially a brief poem like this one, that sort of fits on people's screens, you know, and that they can look at while they're scrolling onto something else. I don't know.
I completely agree, because you can also see, you know, whatever your opinions are on a poet like Rupi Kaur, there's no getting away from the fact that she's the most widely read poet in forever. And the point is, you know, and that sort of she's also doing something that and like spreading the word about poetry. Like I also feel very passionate about poetry because I might have told this story already at Gŵyl, so I'm sorry if anyone's hearing this for the second time, but I've got several friends who are very close and who are voracious readers, you know, but they didn't read poetry, or haven't, you know, didn't until a few years ago. And it was kind of from a point of view of like, oh, I'll be wrong, I won't get it, I don't get poetry, all this sort of thing. And it's just, you know, the poetry you're exposed to in school is very unlikely, in my opinion, because of how it's chosen to be poetry that's actually going to resonate with you or do what poetry does and sort of fulfill its form in a way that novels don't. So I
think that's a very important point, and I think that's very important for all of us to remember if we are teachers, you know, when I generally have university level students, and they've been taught so many times that they can't understand poetry, that they're not good enough, that poetry is on this altar, you know, that only the select few are able to comprehend. And I'm sorry to use this word, but sorry, not sorry, it's bullshit. You know, poetry is for everyone. Poetry, there's poetry in every register about every subject you can possibly imagine, you know. And so I think it's important to do away with that. I think the same applies a lot of times to drawing. How many times have you known people who say, oh, I can't draw? And you say, everyone can draw, you know. If you can write a sentence on a piece of paper, you can draw. And so it's just sort of a question of when we're teaching, not slamming doors shut, but opening them as much as possible, you know, because once you learn to love poetry, I'm afraid there's no going back.
Absolutely. And that's actually my experience of drawing. Was never very good as a child, and you know, there's always like those people in class who are fantastic, and then thought I couldn't do it, and then, you know, picked up painting and stuff a few years ago, and now I love it. So, you know, it really can surprise you. Yeah. I wanted to touch on, just before we end, meter, because I find meter very interesting. again, maybe a sort of thing that's hidden as like very potentially, you know, jargony, or I don't understand like what meter that poem is in, like I can't make it out. And you know, actually like, you know, in like innately. And there are certain things like you know, iambic pentameter is very natural to English. Like there's a reason iambic pentameter is the one you've maybe have come across. It's because it's how English naturally speaks and writes and sounds. And so for example, French can't so there's a great video Tom Scott made called Why Shakespeare Couldn't Have Been French, because French doesn't have French as a language wouldn't work in iambic pentameter in the same way. And I was wondering if there was anything you noticed about meter in Spanish.
Well, and also, you know, the French apparently found a lot of Shakespeare to be just too obscene. His mixing of genres, the fact that he had characters touching their nose on stage, things like that, you know.
I didn't know that.
It was a long struggle for Bill, you know, to make it in other parts of Europe. This is I'm so glad you touched on this, because I have a personal obsession with this very topic. And I mentioned this whole huge disadvantage we have in English at being subjunctive deprived. But on the other hand, we have the enormous advantage when we translate into English, especially as far as poetry is concerned. There's so much variation in vocal sounds, in vowels. I mean, just the A has over 5 sounds, right? And the plosives, that people who write in Spanish, who write poetry in Spanish, have to fight against that natural rhyminess of the Romance, some of the Romance languages, you know. And Spanish, like French, you know, their go-to would be the endecasílabo or the alejandrino, you know, or maybe octavas reales, none of which are iambic pentameter. But you know, when I wrote a book of sonnets a few years back, my wonderful translator here in Mexico, a wonderful poet called Hernán Bravo Varela, he chose to translate them in alejandrinos, you know, in the 14 syllable form, with a sort of hemistichio or separation there, a breath in the middle of the verse, and to do away with the rhyme scheme, you know, to make it different, but yet you still know that there's an order there. Why did he do this? Because English is more economical than Spanish. You know, we translators, we tend to charge by the word, and you always tell your client, okay, but you know, when you make your word count of the original Spanish, realize that it's going to be less, you know, because English is just less wordy. We have all these contractions, apostrophes, tricks, and whatnot that kind of keep things a little shorter, you know, or more brief, I suppose. And so I think that in terms of meter, even if you want to conserve the idea of meter, as a translator, you should consider maybe a different meter, you know, or a different scheme, so that you can keep it interesting, you know, instead of sort of letting that meter become, I mean, it's been referred to by Octavio Paz as a golden cage, you know. But I think that if you let yourself become too bogged down by it, then there's nothing gold about it. It's just the cage, you know. And so, but there are different ways to get around that, I think, if you take some liberties and go at it creatively.
Fantastic. So to wrap up, if anyone does translate that poem Chess, I can't remember what it was in Spanish now, please do submit it, send it to me on Instagram, DM me or Twitter, or you can email it as well. You can find those on my on the website, and I would love to see it, and I'll pass it on to Tanya as well.
I'd love to see them too.
And is there anything you are working on at the moment that is interesting you and you'd like to talk about, or anything you'd like to plug before we wrap up here?
I have been working on several books this year, but I think they're probably another year away. But I'll definitely give you a link to my most recent book of poetry, which is called Solastalgia, and also maybe you'd be interested in looking at some illustrations I did for a children's book. It's in Spanish, about migrants, which is another topic that, of course, as someone who lives in another a country that is not her birth country, is a topic that I hold very dear, and is called Vidas sin Fronteras, or Lives Without Borders. I can give you links to both of those, and I would love to invite everyone, especially to take a look at Literal Latin American Voices.
It was me saying it like literal earlier.
Yeah, literal. I kind of I tripped myself up there, because a lot of the content is just left in Spanish. It's not bilingual. In a way, I think what we wanted to suggest to the United States is, Spanish is your second language. You better start learning, because it's not going away. It's going to become more and more important as time goes on. And I'd love it if any of you took a look at it. Let me know what you think. We're always glad to hear from people from other parts of the world. And so I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person to know you en vivo, as we say in Spanish, but I'm actually rather glad that technology allows us this opportunity to know each other, to meet one another, and to be able to talk about such lovely topics for a while.
Me too. Me too. I think that as soon as you start having to consider logistics in people's lives that involve more than a few hours, things become really difficult for people. And there is something wonderful about the fact that you can just do it in a smaller amount of time, and it allows much more flexibility for a wider variety of people. So yeah, thank you so much, Tanya. It's been an absolute joy. I've really enjoyed it.
It's been wonderful.
Not at all. And thank you very much for watching. All the links are down below, including Tanya's literal. I try. And you can check out the rest of our talks on our YouTube, which you are presumably watching right now. Count how many times I've made that joke whilst wrapping up a talk. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.